In 1945, he had 3 small children, and my mom didn't drive. His mom and dad lived close by, but nobody had ways of transportation too much. But duty called, so Dad had to go. I would have been a month and a half old whenever he went to Georgia for his military. So Dad's stay in the military was very limited, which everybody was lucky for that regard, because Dad was a big part of his home on the farm. My grandfather had 2 other sons, but they all did work around the farm, and they did some construction, but mostly farming at that time. So they were all needed for those jobs. In 1948, my dad built the house that we grew up in. They had a block factory, and they made concrete blocks, and he built the house, and it was a work because he worked on it the whole time. And he did really a good job, though, because it still stands today, and it's a really strong house. In 1961, he started selling Women of the World life insurance, and Dad never went into anything that he didn't do a good job at. He was made the President's Club in Women of the World in a matter of like 6 months. He knew so many people. He loved to talk. He could talk them into buying that insurance whether they wanted it or not. One guy said the only way to get rid of Ernie was to buy the insurance, or he'd be there till morning, and that's about the case of it. But he knew how important it was. School bus, and Dad drove school bus. My husband drove school bus, and we've now passed it down to my son, who drives school bus. So I don't know why they like to drive that school bus, but they got to get them kids to school. They would haul concrete, they would haul rocks and all this stuff, and their old truck, sometimes the brakes would give out on him, and he'd say, "Hang on, we're going for a ride today." It was like, oh my gosh. Mother would just have a fit. "You kids don't need to go with your dad. That truck isn't safe." But he always got it, though. Never hurt any of us, so he knew what he was doing. Jane Fox, who was principal of the school, and I worked with Jane one year, and she is really a very smart and intelligent person. And when I started working at the school, it was 1974, and I was a parent home coordinator through Title I. It was a new program that the government had put together, and you visit the home through the school, and you would take activities for them to work with. Well, they didn't have activities like they have today, the handheld computers, and we would make math games and reading games and everything, and the teacher would say, "Okay, this child needs work in phonics," so you would take a phonics game home into the school. And I did that, and that was probably the most educational thing I had did up till that time, because not only was it an outreach for the school, but a learning experience for me, because I could see what kids really had to work with. They had to work with a teacher and their home, and if they had a bad home atmosphere, you could sense that, and sometimes you could help them and say, "Hey, they need to go in and help this child, or they need this or that." And that winter was so bad, and I was out on that highway every day going to different houses, and I tell you, you really learn a lot when you visit every child's home. And sometimes the teachers would go with me, and then other times they wouldn't. Most of the time that was my own thing, and I'd visit 8 to 10 homes a day. Some days you didn't get such a good welcome because you didn't really call ahead, you just did it. But more women were home at that time because not as many people worked. But that was a big learning experience, and one time I said to Jane, "I don't know how in the world you do this job you do. How do you satisfy everybody?" And she said, "The first thing you do is what you feel is right. If you feel that's right, then that's what you stick with it. And if they can convince you otherwise, then you learn to make adjustments." And when we got the store, I told Jane, I said, you know, you really made a big part of the way I work this, because if I feel something is really right, I just stick to my gun. And then it takes them to convince me otherwise. And but she is she was a big part of that elementary school and the way it works. And she was very professional, and that helped. But she's probably one of my fondest people of how it affects you is what you do. Her and my dad, you know, between the two of them. You got to have faith in God. Jane was, you do what you feel is right in your gut, and you'll make it. So therefore, here we are. And the old timers coming in would all have their own little stories. And Davy wasn't allowed to drink in the house. And so he always kept his little whiskey bottle out in his wood pile. And my boys, they were just like 11 and 13, 14 years old. And he would tell them boys about his whiskey wood pal all the time. And he's the one that could tell you the alphabet backwards and repeat the presidents of the United States. So every time he'd come in, one of them would corner him. Hey, Davy, tell us the presidents. And he would rub his face like the Three Stooges, and he'd whip them right out. Bud Fisher, he had a dog named Henner, and he fed him chocolate Hershey bars. And every day he'd want a Hershey bar for Henner. And everybody said that that chocolate was going to kill that dog. And he said, he's not dead yet, and I've been doing it for 20 years. And so the health department came in the store one day and said, no dogs is allowed in the store, because they was in there. He'd always come in and go over to the Hershey bar, and then get his Hershey bar and then go back out. So I put a sign on the window saying, no dogs allowed. Bud looked at that sign and he said, what do you mean, no dogs allowed? And I said, the health department was here, and I said, I cannot have dogs in the store. He just dropped it down like that, walked out. He said, if the dog's not allowed, neither am I. And I said, Bud, that's not it. I can't risk having the dog in here. If the health department comes, they'll close the doors. He said, dog's not allowed, neither am I. Until the day that man died, he never came back in, because we couldn't let the dog in. But I bet if anybody ever bought furniture in town, you had to get it from Ollie Guard. And you could go on this flooring in the back, and you could look down at the river. You'd be walking back there, and he'd say, don't you kids go jumping around back there. And it's like, oh, we didn't realize the danger. My gosh, if that thing would have fell through, we'd have been in that river. We'd have been washed away. It was, but Mom and Dad must not have worried, because they never told us we couldn't. Well, how much do you have today, Ernie? He'd say, well, how about $10? Okay, I'll take $10. The next Sunday we'd go again. Well, how much do you have? How about $5? Well, that'll do, and we'd take it home. And we've got those big dressers with the mirrors on. Oh my gosh, we had to get the truck to haul that thing home. But it held a lot of clothes, and we still have that big old dresser to this day. It's solid wood. It must have a 4-inch top on it. It was he could do about anything, but he worked on the towers, the electric towers that they built for the electric to come through. And Granddaddy started in Morgantown, and I do have pictures of him and and his brothers. My grandfather was Leslie Savage, and Jack and George putting up these towers from Morgantown to Hagerstown. And they would climb the towers just like they do the cell towers today, except they didn't have the safety equipment then that they have now. And he would stay there. And there was one power plant, I think it was in Pittsburgh, that he worked on a lot to help to get the power through this area. And Granddaddy would be away from home a lot, so then, therefore, then the boys would have to do what it was. But after that went through, he started the construction company and the block company. And my grandfather, Leslie, went on to serve in the House of Delegates in the 60s. He served one full term, I know, and that would have been in 60 to 63 or 64. And he was a worker, and he drove school bus. And he was a teacher. I have a picture of him. He taught school at White Rock, and he was only 16 years old, and he was the teacher. In going to the stores, Cecil Schroyer's store was on the corner, and it burned. But that was my favorite store because they had everything. They had dresses, they had material, they had sewing things, they had stovepipe, they had stoves, anything that you wanted. And it was such a narrow store, but they just had it lined up along the wall. You could get fresh fish, salted fish. They had ice cream and sodas, candy bars. We always embroidered a lot with just little kids growing up. Mother taught us to embroidery, so we would go and want a scan of embroidery thread or whatever. And they would have some produce. And my first copy of Indian Blood I bought in that store. They still had the store there when Evelyn Olsen published Indian Blood in 1983 or 4. We had the store a few years when that store burned, because I thought, oh my gosh, we're going to lose everything, because it was such a hot fire. And it just, again, my dad would say, the good Lord was with us, because there was no wind. It just went right straight up. It was so hot, it went so quickly. And the fire department put water on Ken's Tavern at the time and our store, and it saved it. Because if it had been a high wind, it would have been gone. It was that the buildings are so close together. But like I said, it was a hot fire. Mandy and Mandy Castile, they came to the store every Friday at 10 o'clock. Only once a week. They wouldn't go anywhere else. They'd come to the store, they would have her list, and she would get her things. Mandy and Okie Castile. And they were both only about 4'10". They were just made for each other. And it's whatever Mandy said, though, that's what Okie did. He would, if she wanted whatever, Mandy got it. She trained him right. She did. And they just lived on the top of the hill, Dixon Hill, right there in that little house that still stands today. But, you know, those people, they had a routine. The older people had routines. They went grocery shopping on Friday night, store or whatever, Friday or Saturday night, and you got what you needed. When we first got the store, they were really good for our business. There was 4 boating people in town. Upper Yock, Precision. What were the other 2? But they would, you know, then you didn't travel everywhere to get your product. They would buy it all from us, the steaks, the fresh fruit, or whatever they would get. So they were probably part of our initial growth that we did do for that period of time. And of course, the only thing that people didn't like, I think mostly, and it's the same problem that we have today, but it's been taken care of a lot, is by making a parking space for them, is the parking along the road. And I think nobody wants to get hit, and nobody wants to be the driver of somebody that gets hit with a car. And I think that was always the fear, that somebody would get hit with a car, because if there was so many more people in town than what used to be. But it's been a big part of our business, and it is still today. You know, they come in, they need drinks, they need steaks, they need food, whatever. And anytime you can increase the amount of people in an area, it's going to make any business better. He was really an intelligent person and a lot of power because he had lots of properties and things, and a lot of people worked for him. You know, he was a source of income for a lot of people, and he hired probably 30, 40 men that worked, and he had work all the time. Spring, summer, winter, fall. There was no such thing as unemployment if you worked for Blaine France. He would make sure he would get that mill up and operational to do something. So he made sure that they were working. And I didn't know them real good. Vernon really liked Blaine. He thought a lot of him. I think he had a heart attack. And when they started to take his property for when the road went through, now I'm just thinking it might not be all true. He got really upset because they was really taking his parcels of ground that he didn't want them to. And I think that he just got so worked up he had a heart attack. Well, when we first got our store, you're just full of ideas of what to do. And of course, things have changed a lot in those 35 years. And in the early 80s, I would have a photographer to come in and take pictures a couple times a year. And so, and we had these old guys, Ed Slager, Bud Fisher, and Duke Fike, and these old guys, the old guys, the old barbershop guys that used to sit at the barbershop and chit-chat all the time. When we used to on pictures, and Ed was just a little short guy, never tied his shoes, always had a rub of tobacco going down his cheek, but just lovable. My youngest daughter, Danielle, thought that he was her grandfather. She just loved him. He wanted his picture taken. And of course, he didn't have much money. He just had a little bit of means to survive on. But the photographer felt sorry for him, and he says, okay, we're going to take your picture. So Ed comes in, he sits down, had his old brown coat on. It was sort of like a camel color, and his derby hat, and it was sort of ragged in the front. And he had cleaned all up, though. He didn't have no tobacco juice. He had a clean shirt on. He was getting his picture taken. And I have his picture if I could find it. And he sat down there, and he starts telling him all these stories, and they're just crackling up back in there listening to Ed talk. And he got his picture taken, and I tell you what, that was his Merry Christmas when he got them pictures. He gave them all out. He gave my daughter one. She put it in her wallet. She carried it with her to school because she loved Ed. But Ed was sitting on a bench over by the VFW where the rafting place is now, but it was the VFW at that time. And we was going home that night, and the boy says, Mom, you got to stop. And I said, why? And they said, there sits Ed. And I said, what do you want me to stop? Let's take him home with us. It's going to be cold tonight, and he needs someplace warm to sleep. And I said, we can't do that. And it's like, yes, we can. We got to give Ed a place to sleep. And so we stopped, and we asked Ed, where are you sleeping? And he said, he had a place. We didn't need to worry about him because he had some place that he could get in warm. But it was so cold that night. The kids just said, we can't go home until we take Ed with us. But he was quite a character. But, and it was good for them to see. He really didn't have a place to live. And there was, as a kid growing up, Feldy Frazee and Bill Frazee, they would take in people that didn't have places to live, and the county would pay them so much money. And I don't know how many people they give shelter to during the winter, because there was homeless people in town. They needed someplace, but she'd put them to work. They had chickens and different things. It's nice to be in a small town and to know your neighbors and help people out.